Hey, friends, before we jump into the episode today, just want to let you know that this episode is part of a replay series that we originally released with Exponential. We called it Plant the Gospel, Water with Love. There's several new voices that you'll hear in this series. So today's episode is just one of 7 that we're releasing. We decided to bring it back because it's just a clear, practical series that we've done for equipping disciple makers and microchurch leaders. And in these episodes, you'll hear this framework around moving from prayer to presence to planting the gospel, along with some simple tools you can start using right where you live, work, learn, or play. Yeah, it's not anything that's like super brand new, but it's all in one compact series. So just wanted you to know that's what you're hearing today. So if you're just jumping in and it's week 6 or 7, you can go back a few. You can find this series on YouTube. These 7 episodes. So just wanted to give you a heads up. We hope you enjoy these 7 episodes. Let's dive in.
Before working for the Underground, I spent the better half of a decade doing campus ministry both here in the States and in the Caribbean. I remember one day in particular, I was on a college campus trying to get a Bible study started, and I was supposed to be meeting with a professor who was going to help us get it off the ground. So I walked into the faculty building where I encountered another instructor who was wondering, who in the world is this random kid who is in this building reserved specifically for faculty? And so she kindly enough asked me, did I need anything? And I just told her, no, I'm meeting with Dr. So-and-so. He and I are going to help me. He's going to help me get an organization started on campus. And so I intentionally left it open-ended and vague because I didn't actually feel like having a spiritual conversation with this person. I just had a meeting I was supposed to go to. And, for whatever reason, this particular instructor wouldn't leave it alone. She decided she was going to ask the question, well, what kind of organization is this? And so I just kind of took a deep breath and thought to myself, well, here we go. Like you asked for it. And I explained, we're starting a Christian group. It's a Bible study. And, most people, when they hear something like that and they're not really interested, they would just say, okay, and go about their business. Or they might say, that's good for you, and leave it at that. But not this person. It's not just that she wasn't a Christian, it's that she was actively anti-Christian. Having grown up in the Bible Belt, she had witnessed and experienced abuse and trauma from being in the church. She had seen how the church had been so against some of her friends in her town that were just different from her, that she just always had a disdain for the church. And so as much as she loved being in the country which we were, it was a very culturally Christian country. So it was beautiful, and she loved the food and all the things about being there. But the thing that she could not stomach and could not handle, and the thing that I think eventually caused her to leave the island, was just how Christians ruled the laws of the land. And she just couldn't get over it. So she berated me with question after question. And very quickly, very early on in the conversation, it became extremely clear that she's not asking me questions for me to respond to. This wasn't a conversation. This was her unleashing her load of rage upon me. And I was just going to be a recipient of whatever she had inside of her that day. And so I think, eventually the professor joined me, but I was just trying to get out of that conversation as quickly as possible. And, I saw her a couple of times later in different points, and we kind of would cross paths, and it was always the same thing. It was just question after question, hatred towards Christians, church, and religion. And as much as I would like to say that something eventually changed and she eventually became a Christian, it never happened. This particular instructor eventually took a sabbatical off the island and then proceeded to move away shortly after that. But this interaction always stuck with me because of the intensity at which she came at me with. We are people who are marked by the grace of God. Ephesians tells us that we were by nature objects of wrath, but because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ even when we were dead in our transgressions. Not only have we gone from death to life, but God has raised us up with Christ and seated us with him in the heavenlies. It is by his grace and for his glory that we get to be called children of God and are made co-heirs with Christ. Like Paul in Acts 26, we say, short time or long, we pray that everybody may become what we are. We want everyone to experience the same incomparable riches of grace that we have. We yearn for everyone to enter the kingdom. Like Romans 10 says, how can they call on one who they have not believed in? And how can they believe in one whom they have not heard? And how can they hear without someone preaching to them? And how can someone preach unless they are sent? As it is written, How beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. But as we can all attest, as beautiful as our feet may be, bringing the good news can be a complicated, messy, and sometimes awkward affair. How do we account for those kinds of people? What does evangelism look like to a person who's so adamantly against the church? I mean, sharing the gospel with that person might actually do more harm than good in a situation like that. We need something that accounts for the different places people are at in their journeys towards Jesus so that we can act as extensions of God's love to them. And one framework that we found particularly helpful in our network is Doug Schopp's and Don Everett's 5 thresholds of postmodern conversion. So recognizing the way that truth has shifted, or our relationship to truth has shifted, they found that while apologetics and reason certainly has a place in sharing our faith, really that gets sort of couched in our life and our example, right? It's no longer about whether or not something is true, but whether or not something works. There seems to be a greater gap between where a person is and where, maybe journeying towards the kingdom. It feels like it's a bigger threshold to cross. To even enter a church feels like a bigger threshold to cross. At least that was the thought when they were sort of developing this framework in their experience. And what they found is maybe there were 5 thresholds that a person had to cross before they actually entered the kingdom, or the final threshold being entering the kingdom. So I'll explain them very quickly here now. So basically, that first threshold, the journey begins when a skeptic starts trusting a Christian. That's the first step. So from what then happens there is that they move from kind of a passivity to actively wondering about the strange life of Christians. This is when they start to develop curiosity. That's the second threshold, is becoming curious about the life of Christians. So they can trust you, but are they asking you questions? Are they curious about what's going on in your life? Why you do the way you do, why you do the things you do, why you act in a certain way. And so if they are asking, the third threshold is whether or not they're open to change, right? And so they would say that this is actually the biggest threshold to cross, because at this point, this is where the skeptic has to begin counting the cost, right? It's no longer just that, oh, Jesus is an interesting option, but to say yes to Jesus, it means that some things about my life are going to change. I'm going to have to surrender the control of my life to someone else. And some people are as curious as they are about Christians and about faith, they're not willing to actually have their life changed, to surrender their life. So that third threshold is a really important one. But if they are open to change, then it becomes a matter of doing the investigative work to figure out, is Jesus who he said he is? Like I think about C.S. Lewis and his trilemma, like is he Lord? Is he liar? Is he lunatic? And, if they can get to the place where they say that he is Lord, they finally do enter the kingdom. So that fourth step is seeking God. Like, are they actively doing the investigative work to figure out who is this person of Jesus? And if they can get to a place where they say he's Lord, that's when they've crossed that fifth threshold of entering the kingdom. So very quickly, just sort of to sum it up, it's trusting a Christian, it's becoming curious, it's being open to change, it's seeking God, and it's finally entering the kingdom. We have used this particular framework in conjunction with a number of other tools in our network, like network mapping or social mapping, as some of you might be familiar with. And so, sometimes people, as they're trying to discern their calling, or, who are the people they should be reaching out to, or where is God sort of stirring up activity in their life, we kind of have them sit down with all the places where they have relationships. So their workplaces and their neighborhoods and their gyms, or the bookstores that they frequent, or the coffee shops that they often go to, and to map out who are the people that they know in those places, right? And so what we'll do, it's a spiritual listening exercise. It's listening prayer, it's Lectio Divina, it's going back through with that list of names and this framework, these 5 thresholds, and to begin to mark, where are these different people in their journey, right? So they might see like, okay, I have a lot of people in my life who are they don't even trust Christians. And so that's the thing that I'm trying to get them to. Other people, they might recognize, okay, yeah, they ask me questions about my life and my faith. If I had to guess, I'd say they're curious. And then sometimes what they might find is that there's a good chunk of Christians who maybe just need to be activated and mobilized to help reach the other people in the other thresholds, right? So it's a really cool way to sort of examine social relationships and to figure out, okay, God, what would you have me do? Because, when you view it this way, you can begin to appropriately assess, what's the appropriate next step, right? It's helpful. It can be instructive. So if somebody's at the first threshold, like that professor was, chances are the altar call is not the right thing to do, right? Like if I had given that person, if I had shared the gospel with that person, that could have ended badly. But if somebody is actively seeking God, if they're in that fourth threshold, you're not going to want to treat them like they're just being curious, right? Like there's an end. They're working towards something. At some point, you do actually have to ask the question, do you want to give your life to Jesus? Like you've done the research. Who do you say he is? And that's important for them to also do. So each threshold invites us to meet seekers where they're at and to love them into the next stage of the journey, right? And maybe the best way to do that is through cultivating curiosity in them, which sometimes only happens by us cultivating curiosity in ourselves, which means asking questions, right? So as cliche as it is to talk about it, we've all heard the number of questions Jesus asks versus the amount of questions he answers, right? And, I was thinking about the fact that, we live in a time where it feels like it's just dogmatism all around us. Like we are awash in bumper stickers and flags and social media posts and t-shirts telling us not just what people believe, but also what we should believe as well. And in the age of my truth, where things can't really be challenged, we have to find a way to get past the walls that people have erected and past the skepticism that's harboring in a person's heart. And I wonder, and I could be wrong, I'm not an expert in this, but I wonder if evangelism in a dogmatic age isn't more dogma, but it's asking questions even as we model the way of Jesus, right? So you can find more specific questions on the PDF document that will link to this video. But basically, each of these thresholds invite us to ask different kinds of questions to help establish rapport and get inside a person's life. So this is questions about their story, about their values, about their needs. When we ask questions, not for the sake of argument, but for genuine understanding, what invariably happens is that they get asked back to you, right? And as you share, you begin to show that you're a real person with a real story, with real questions. And you yourself become a trustworthy person because you've demonstrated vulnerability, right? Not like a contrived vulnerability, but a genuine one. And you've also shared, hopefully, as people have asked you questions, how Jesus intersects with your story and with your life and your questions. To me, this is, the powerful thing about, say, something like 1 Peter 3, always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you, to give the reason for the hope that you have. People have to ask the question, which maybe they will only do if we ask the right questions first. What I love about this tool, aside from the fact that it gives language to people's faith journeys, is how it relieves the pressure for someone to get, a person from the kingdom of darkness all the way to the kingdom of God's marvelous light. Like, what if your role actually is simply to play your part in getting them from one threshold to another? And can we see that as evangelism? We often think of evangelism as a one-time gospel proclamation. I think about contact evangelism, or, you're knocking on somebody's door with a track, or, you're outside of a concert with a bullhorn and you're open air preaching. And somehow that's what we conflate with evangelism, which is maybe why so many of us are uncomfortable with that word and the idea of being an evangelist. But what if there's more? What if the person who shares Jesus with someone over the course of time is just as much of an evangelist as a person who shares Jesus with the person in a given moment, right? This is what Alan Hirsch and Tim Catchem talk about in The Permanent Revolution, that it's not just the person who is proclaiming the gospel at some sort of evangelistic event, that's the evangelist, but it's also the friend that invites the person to go to the evangelistic event that is also an evangelist. Both of those things matter. And so, at the risk of introducing too many ideas in one condensed video, I do think that, Michael Frost, when he talks about this in Surprise the World, that it just I thought it was really fascinating, this idea that Paul has these two approaches to evangelism, essentially, that some people are, in fact, gifted evangelists. Like that's how God has made them. He has just sort of blessed them with that gift. And yet, that's Ephesians 4. And yet there are some people who maybe aren't gifted evangelists, but are still called to do the work of an evangelist. That's all of us. That's 2 Timothy 4, that even though we might not be gifted evangelists, we still are called to do the work of an evangelist. And what I love about this framework is that it enables both these parties, those who are gifted in evangelism and those who aren't, to do better the work of an evangelist. And so in coming videos, you'll receive tools on how to more effectively communicate the good news of the gospel and maybe frameworks for how to do that. But in this particular video, I wanted to almost take a step back and say, okay, well, before you actually share the gospel with a person, what if there's a journey that people go through? If I had this tool, maybe when I was thinking about that professor, all those years ago, maybe I would have taken a more concerted effort to build trust with them, to ask questions about their life, to, get at the heart of their values and what they see in the world, and talk about, hopefully, if I was asked, the way that Jesus intersects with all that in my own world. But, it didn't really happen that way. And that's okay. God is sovereign. And so who knows? Each of us are called to play our part. So that's, Paul watering, Paul planting the seed, Apollos watering, God giving it growth. And that's what we do. We just want to play our part in the story that God is weaving. And so hopefully this video has been helpful for you. You can find more information at tampaunderground.com/toolkit. And there you will find this particular PDF document that I'm talking about, the 5 thresholds of conversion and conversation. Thank you so much for listening to this video. May you be